Since the release of Cuphead's DLC, there have been many videos made ranking its bosses from easiest to hardest. However, I noticed that not a single video exists ranking every boss from worst to best. So I took it upon myself to give my very informed and not at all controversial opinion. As always with this sort of video, these rankings are my own opinion, and I have used no objective criteria to rank them. I've split the bosses into tiers as shown on screen, which will be showed by the colour of the boss's name. With that being said, let's start off with the worst boss in the game. Coming in at dead last is Cala Maria. This boss shows the heavily unbalanced nature of some of its bosses, which was instead sacrificed for difficulty. In this boss, the majority of your deaths will come from being frozen in place, making it impossible to dodge an incoming obstacle. 0 out of 10, MDHR, please fix. Beating the mermaid out by just a hair is Rumor Honeybottom's. They could honestly both be tied for last place. This fight uses randomly generated platforms to mix up each attempt. However, all they do is restrict the player's movement and make some attacks, just like Cala Maria, impossible to dodge. Another 0 out of 10 boss. You may be surprised to see the final boss appear in the bottom 3. However, I find the devil to be an underwhelming encounter that I have no interest in going back and fighting. This boss would at least be mediocre if it weren't so infuriatingly difficult. Perhaps the most controversial placement on this list, the final boss of the delicious last course closes out the trash tier. Chef Saltbaker feels the need to throw an endless onslaught of random projectiles at you, which would be reasonable if not for the random fireball that for some reason sticks around into Phase 2. And apparently MDHR didn't learn from the atrocity that is Rumor Honeybottom's, since the final phase of this fight once again sees you go up against randomly generated platforms, this time with only one on each layer. Djimmi The Great marks the first plain level on this list, and for me he's certainly the worst one. This fight is obnoxious bullet hell at its finest from start to finish, and nothing from this fight stands out to me as being all that special. Sally Stageplay has a place in the bad tier, not for being frustrating or badly designed as such, more for the fact that I just find her to be an uninteresting boss, and I have much more fun fighting the bosses higher up on the list. Moonshine Mob is the second DLC boss on this list, and up to the third phase, it is a good one. But that ball of bugs on the third phase has far too much health, and I have no fun at all fighting the Anteater. I did love the fake knockout sign though. Dr. Carl's robot is up next, yet another flying level. The first phase of this fight is just like Djimmi, except ridiculously more difficult. The second phase is mostly focused on trying to get a hit in on the head, which will just not stay still. This fight is only elevated by the final phase, which I do thoroughly enjoy. The last boss I would consider bad is the last of the King's Leap bosses, the Queen. This fight conceptually is really solid, however the execution is somewhat flawed. I wish the cannons didn't rotate, as they often fire in very random directions that make hitting the Queen a challenge. Now we're into the tier representing the bosses that are just fine. First off is yet another plain level, Wally Warbles. This boss isn't terrible, however Phase 3 can be tedious, and the rest of the phases aren't particularly unique, so the bird lands at the bottom of OK tier. Following directly after that is another plain fight, Hilda Berg. This fight doesn't do anything especially wrong, however it is held down due to its status as a plain level, as well as the ridiculous length of the fight. One of the simplest fights in the game is next, Goopy Le Grande. Goopy is the bread and butter platformer boss, however he is nothing more than that, so he lands himself at the number 20 spot. The first King's Leap fight is next. The pawns are a very simple fight, however I enjoy using the parry mechanic to take out this horde of enemies, so they find themselves a spot above Goopy. Following on with another King's Leap boss, the Bishop. I really like the concept of putting out the candles to be able to parry him, so the Bishop ends up around the middle of the list. The game's tutorial boss is up next. The Root Pack is perhaps the easiest boss in the game, but that's to be expected of the one most players will fight first. And this boss does nothing else wrong, however its simplicity holds it back from a higher placement. One of the most unique and interesting fights in the game, the Angel and the Devil, is next. This boss must be found with a complex puzzle, and once it's unlocked, it's a fight unlike any other in the game. The soundtrack for this fight is impeccable, and so different to any other, and it was awesome to have a rematch against the game's final boss. However, the mechanics of this fight, while unique, do not work that well in game, so I have to keep it down at the OK tier. Next up is another DLC boss, Mortimer Freezer. The animations for this boss are absolutely perfect, however, Phase 1 is very boring. Phase 2 is solid, however, I believe the flying minions add an unneeded component to this fight. This boss would also benefit from having more opportunities to parry, so I just can't justify giving it a higher placement. Kinq Dice is one of the most iconic bosses in the game, and I love the final battle with the boss himself. However, this boss can become tedious when, upon death, the player must fight for a minimum of 3 mini-bosses all over again, none of which are particularly interesting. A decent boss to be sure, but not a great one. I must say, on my first playthrough, this boss did not give me a rush of anything but anger. However, on subsequent attempts, I have come to realise that this boss certainly has its strengths, and I think it's well deserving of being at the top of the OK tier. The Knight is a fight I was very intrigued by when it was first revealed. The parry mechanic is used so uniquely here, and this boss's design is top notch. However, this fight tends to drag on a bit, so it takes the number 12 spot. Grim Matchstick is yet another memorable boss, and certainly a tough one. It has such a wacky yet menacing design. Phase 1 and Phase 3 are great, however Phase 2 is a little less well executed. This fight even uses randomly generated platforms in a way that doesn't completely ruin the fight, however their presence drops the boss down a few spots. Glumstone The Giant was one of the first DLC bosses to be revealed, and at first I was not particularly interested in this fight. Upon fighting this boss, however, he does not disappoint. Sometimes his combinations of attacks can be frustrating, although those occurrences are not so frequent as to ruin the boss. Cagneyslarnation is a boss that well resembles Cuphead as a game. Its attacks are nothing too complicated, but they pair together well, and this fight steers clear of adding components just to up the difficulty. This boss is well deserving of its place in the top 10. The final flying level on this list is Esther Winchester, and it is far and away the best. This is the only plane level that I truly enjoy, mainly due to how creative and unique all of its phases are. It's such an out-of-the-box concept for a boss, and the execution is about as good as a plane level can get. My favourite of the King's Leap bosses is the Rook. The parry mechanic is used in such a creative way once again, and I believe the difficulty of this boss is balanced perfectly. Beppy the Clown is a boss that fits the art style of Cuphead so well. There is a noticeable absence of stupid random projectiles in this fight compared to fights lower on this list, and each phase is great in its own way. This boss only missed out on the top 5 due to the impeccable quality of the bosses above it. This is such an interesting concept for a boss. Werner Herman fits perfectly into the world of Cuphead, and his gameplay is excellent. This boss is certainly helped by the fact that it is not obnoxiously difficult, like the bosses in the bottom tiers. Captain Brineybeard is a near-perfect boss. The boat kicking Brineybeard off and attacking you of its own will was such a cool phase transition. The barrel adds an extra element to keep track of that makes movement key, but does not detract from the rest of the fight, like the fireball in Chef Saltbaker. Now we've reached the best of the best, bosses that I consider without flaw. The first of these is Ribby and Croaks. This is a duo fight done beyond well. The frog's attacks are built around one another, but don't overwhelm the player with too many projectiles. The Slots Machine final phase changes the pace of the fight completely, certainly a 10 out of 10 boss. The Phantom Express is such a creative design for a boss. The fight just gets better and better as the phases progress. This fight also somehow manages to include another duo fight, successfully. This boss is also incredibly difficult, but all of that difficulty comes in the form of a fair and balanced challenge. It seems fitting to end off the list with a boss from the DLC. The Howling Aces is easily the best thing to come from the delicious last course, and I'm always looking for new ways to approach the fight. Phase 1 is my favourite phase of any boss in the game. It is so well balanced, with importance placed on positioning due to the tennis balls, and ample opportunities to perform parries. The second phase has many of the same strengths. The final phase doesn't disappoint either, with varying but fair laser patterns, and an insane mechanic of your screen being flipped around. I also love the way you control your platform of the plane. I would take this fight over a real plane level any day. If the past two bosses were 10 out of 10, this fight goes far beyond even that, and I'm confident in saying it's the greatest fight in the game. So that about wraps up my rankings of every Cuphead boss based on quality. You may have agreed, you may have not. If you disagreed, whack it in the comments below and explain why. Honestly, at this point, I don't know why I'm doing an outro for the singular person who skipped to the end. If you want to like the video and subscribe to my shambles of a channel, then it would be greatly appreciated, but I would greatly recommend sparing yourself the mental agony. Although, if you don't, I will have to send my horde of pet parrot to siege your home. So take that into consideration, you know? Thank you and good night.